Hi, and welcome to the show where we share the stories of the many who intersect with our healthcare system but are rarely heard from. My name is Kevin Poe, founder and editor of Kevin MD. Today on the show, we have Maggie Connolly. She's a surgery resident and wrote a Kevin MD article, How Are the Residents Doing During the Pandemic? Maggie, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
All right, we're going to get into your article in a little bit. But first off, please share a story in your journey to where you are today.
Sure. So I was born and raised in Baltimore City, and I grew up with my mom being an emergency department nurse. And so I sort of started getting into medicine. When she would come home, I would ask her about her patients, and I always wanted to know particularly about the traumas. And so she started getting me into the ED when I was in high school, and then went on from there. And I went to Washington and Lee for college, which I loved. And then I spent a year in DC doing stroke research, and then back to Baltimore for med school, where I fell in love with trauma. And then I came to the MGH for residency.
Fantastic. And you are at Massachusetts General Hospital. And how has the pandemic affected you and your institution?
Yeah, so I am in my first year of research, just finishing that now. So I haven't been clinical, but when COVID came here, basically all of our labs shut down, and the research residents became clinical again. So my role has been primarily in one of our COVID surge ICUs. It used to be the burn ICU, and then it became a COVID ICU. And I also was a member on our new COVID line team. So we do arterial lines, central lines, dialysis lines for the COVID patients. And for me, it's been really rewarding to be able to have such an active role that feels like it matters when everything else is kind of so crazy and you can't do much of your normal life. This is something that I can do, and it feels good to be able to do it.
Well, thank you so much for doing what you do. Definitely much needed on the front lines. So you wrote the Kevin MD article. How are the residents doing during the pandemic? Can you tell me the story behind that article and why you decided to write it?
Yeah, I was asked to give a town hall for the Department of Surgery on how the residents were doing. My program director asked me to do it. And initially I was super enthusiastic. I was like, of course I will do that. I'm going to tell everyone how much I love working in the ICU and how great it is when you're able to extubate someone who's been intubated for 3 weeks. And then I started talking to some of my co-residents who I am not working as closely with. They're not in this ICU. And I realized that while I had been feeling like I was having a relatively positive experience, not everyone felt that way. So what I had planned to be a really uplifting report from the front lines, I realized that wasn't fully honest and representative of everyone. So I talked to a lot of residents. I wrote down everything they said, and then I sort of organized it and came up with what seemed like a relatively appropriate way to say it to the whole Department of Surgery, representing the people who were struggling as well as the people who were doing well, without sort of throwing anyone under the bus or making it look like anyone was whining and complaining.
So maybe if you could go into a little bit more detail, what were some of the challenges that you heard from your other residents?
There's a lot of challenges, and there'll be a challenge for one person that is a strength or a highlight for someone else. And I think that just is a testament that we're all handling this differently. But one of the things that some people had a challenge with was some people got redeployed, and it was a random selection. And so some people who got redeployed to other services felt like the department didn't value them as much. And thankfully, they realized that they had an important role on these other services where they went to help. But initially, that was a big frustration. And then other residents who were on services that were totally unrelated to COVID, and it felt like they were just kind of babysitting patients at night, felt like they didn't have a useful role. And so the sort of overarching complaint in terms of the roles was if you weren't doing something that felt useful to exactly what is going on now, it became more of a problem of burnout and frustration with the job.
And what kind of support did your institution offer to these residents who came up with these challenges?
We tried different things. They sent out some psychiatric support or some groups that you could talk with or counselors you could talk to. And then what was the best thing for me was when an attending just sent me an email and said, "Hey, just checking in, how are you doing?" Which I encouraged other attendings to do for everyone because that mattered so much. But I think the biggest support really is us for each other. We're a pretty tight knit group, and if we see someone struggling, I think we all sort of band together and recognize that and try to help that person.
And speaking for your fellow residents, what are some things that your institution can do to help address these challenges going forward?
I think one of the frustrations has been, or fears, is that burnout is starting or happening, and now we just a couple of weeks ago started opening up our operating rooms again, which everyone's excited about because they missed operating, but at the same time have sort of felt overworked. And so having some way to decompress and sort of release some of the anxieties or fears or stresses that have built up would be well received.
Sure. So you're a general surgery resident, and I was wondering if you could comment on how the pandemic has affected your training.
It's probably been not as much of an effect for me because I'm in research. The challenge is for me, I was about 9 months into my first of 2 years of research and really starting to get into the swing of it when the lab just shut down
Mhm.
and all the progress that I had made sort of came to a screeching halt. So that has been frustrating, and luckily our lab just reopened, so we're starting to get back to everything there. But that was a huge hold up, and a third of the year went by basically that I lost of only 2 years. um, but in terms of the training for clinical surgery, I didn't miss anything there.
So let's take a step back, and we're talking in the first week of June now, and as you said, things are opening up in Boston. So if you could give a prediction over the next few months, what's your perspective in terms of how that's going to affect not only your training, but your hospital as a whole?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I knew the answer to it. The most recent graphs that I've seen have been predicting a second wave to happen in August, and to be worse than the original one, although maybe not as sharp of an incline, but an overall more amount of people getting sick. So I sort of am expecting to get called back into the hospital in around August. That could come sooner because that graph, I think, was made just before all of the sort of unrest has begun. And I think people are out and in contact with each other a little bit more than we thought everyone would be. So it may be sooner that we start to see people in the hospital again.
And I was wondering if you could share your audience something that you've been curious about recently or something that you've been passionate about.
Well, my new hobby, I don't know if it's truly a passion. I'm teaching myself how to embroider. Um, and so that's a little bit of technical skills for surgery, I guess. And it's a nice way to sort of decompress at the end of the day. Um, I don't know that I'd call it a passion though.
And I think it's tremendously important to have a hobby, just something out of medicine, because medicine is just so all-consuming.
Yeah.
And my final question, what's your take-home message for the Kevin MD audience?
Yeah. I think that I sort of already touched on this a little bit. If you are a family member or a mentor or a friend or an acquaintance of anybody who's been working in the COVID unit or taking care of patients or working a little extra harder, some essential employee, all you have to do is reach out. The email that I got from my attending saying, hi, I'm just checking in. I want to make sure you're okay. It meant so much to me. And that would take 5 seconds of someone's time to do. I mean, you could do more. You could send a bottle of wine or you could send a box of treats, but really just checking in with some of the people who have dealt with a lot of, or carried a lot of the burden of caring for very sick patients. And I think that would be huge.
Well, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your story and your insight. On the show, we have Maggie Connolly. She's a general surgery resident, and she wrote the Kevin MD article, How Are the Residents Doing During the Pandemic? Maggie, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you.